Welcome back, everyone, to another Explainer. Today, we're cracking open the Forensic Detective's Playbook. We're taking a really gripping dive into how forensics can literally read wounds to solve complex crimes. We'll be looking closely at the specific biology and physics of lacerations, and how these tiny, subtle physical clues can break a rock-solid alibi wide open. Let's get right into it.
Okay, I want you to just think about this for a second. How exactly do you prove that a fatal car crash was actually a brutal, staged murder? Like, how do investigators untangle a totally fabricated crime scene using literally nothing but human biology and a little bit of physics? It sounds impossible, right? Well, it kind of is until you know exactly what to look for.
The secret actually lies in the trauma itself. Forensics use lacerations to map out the exact angle, the specific weapon used, and even the intent behind a crime. So today, we're going to learn exactly how to map out a crime scene by reading those very specific, undeniable clues left behind on the human body.
Right. To start things off, we actually need to completely redefine a word that you probably hear and use all the time: laceration. In forensic medicine, a laceration is specifically a wound where the skin, mucosa, or underlying tissues are torn as a result of blunt force. It is not a clean slice from a sharp blade. That's called an incised wound. A laceration is all about blunt trauma stretching, crushing, and eventually just tearing the tissue apart.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how the body's own anatomy actually changes the physics of the wound. The exact same blow creates a totally different injury depending on what's right underneath the skin. If you strike rigid tissue, like the scalp stretching over the hard skull, the skin tears really easily, often simulating a clean, incised knife wound. But if that exact same blunt force hits flexible tissue, like a cheek or the abdomen, the soft tissue just absorbs the force. So a tear happens much less readily and might just leave a jagged, irregular margin, or sometimes, honestly, just a bruise.
Because the angle and force of an impact can vary so wildly out in the real world, rely on a highly specific field guide. There are 5 distinct classifications of lacerations: split laceration, stretch laceration, avulsion, tears, and internal laceration. Understanding these 5 types is exactly how an investigator reconstructs the precise mechanics of a violent event. Let's break these down one by one.
First up is the split laceration. This one is caused by a direct, blunt, perpendicular impact. Imagine the skin literally getting crushed straight on between 2 hard objects, right? Like the weapon coming down and the bone underneath. It creates a linear split that, as we mentioned earlier, can super easily be mistaken for a sharp cut. In fact, they're so deceptive that when they happen on the scalp, investigators often have to completely shave the victim's hair around the injury just to use a magnifying glass and spot the subtle, crushed characteristics hidden deep inside the wound.
Next, we've got the stretch laceration. Unlike the straight-on crush of a split laceration, a stretch laceration is caused by a tangential or glancing impact. The blunt force basically overstretches the skin until it finally just gives way, splitting into a flap. And here is the absolute forensic goldmine. That flap actually points back to the direction of the force. So, whether a head is striking a car windshield during an accident, or someone's taking a glancing kick from a heavy boot, the skin flap literally acts as an arrow pointing right back toward the origin of the blow.
Okay, you might want to brace yourself for this next one because the mechanics of an avulsion are incredibly intense. This happens from a horizontal grinding compression. It is so severe that it completely separates the skin from the deeper structures beneath it. Forensically, this is known as degloving of the skin. Typically see this kind of massive horizontal crushing impact in major industrial accidents with heavy machinery, or when the heavy wheels of a truck pass over a limb, just aggressively grinding and peeling the skin right off the muscle. It's brutal.
But what if there's no mark on the skin at all? Well, that brings us to internal lacerations, and this is a genuinely terrifying surprise for investigators. When blunt force exceeds the tensile strength and elasticity of an internal organ, like the liver or the pancreas, massive internal tearing can happen while leaving absolutely zero visible external marks on the skin. So, a fatal kick to the upper abdomen or a really forceful punch to the chest can actually cause death without leaving a single visible abrasion or bruise on the surface of the body. Crazy, right?
So, the absolutely crucial point here is knowing how to look inside the wound itself to confirm it's actually a blunt force laceration. 2 massive clues always stand out. First, and this is pretty counterintuitive, crushed blood vessels actually bleed significantly less than clean cuts. Second, because blunt force divides the deeper tissues unevenly, intact strands of nerves, vessels, or tissue are left spanning right across the gap of the wound. Call this tissue bridging, and it looks almost like a gruesome little suspension bridge crossing the depth of the laceration. And this brilliantly illustrates how to figure out the specific murder weapon. Just take a look at this forensic cheat sheet. The shape of a lacerated surface often perfectly matches the weapon's striking profile. So, a hammer? It produces a very distinct concentric laceration. What about a blunt, pointed metal rod? Well, that leaves a stellate, or star-shaped wound. And a stick typically leaves a linear laceration with a highly specific split end that looks like a Y. By closely examining those margins, investigators can essentially reverse engineer the exact object the killer was holding in their hand.
Speaking of sticks, they leave some highly specific clues. Lacerations from linear objects like sticks are sometimes confused with injuries from falling, but a trained eye is always going to look for shelving. This is where one margin of the wound basically overrides the other due to angulation or a glancing strike. Along with linear parallel abrasions running along the wound's edges, the shelving acts as a literal forensic compass. The direction of the shelf tells you the exact angle and direction of that devastating blow.
So, how does actually apply all this biology and physics at a messy crime scene? They follow a super precise checklist. Step 1, search the very depth of the lacerated wound for trace evidence. Because the skin is crushed and torn open, foreign material, pieces of paint, grease, or grit from the weapon, often gets trapped right inside. Step 2, search the surrounding scene for objects stained with blood, hair, or tissue fragments. And Step 3, carefully assess the overall pattern of the injury to piece the whole event together. As they assess that overall pattern, they can use a few incredible investigative shortcuts. For instance, because tearing and crushing skin causes immense, truly agonizing pain, suicidal lacerations are extremely rare. Unless a victim is in a very active phase of severe mental illness, people simply don't take their own lives using severe blunt force trauma. This means that right out of the gate, most severe lacerations can be quickly categorized by detective as either accidental or homicidal.
Let's see how all this biology translates to solving a real-world mystery. Take this infamous case recorded by Dr. Barrowcliff. A woman was brutally attacked and murdered with a car jack to the head. To cover their tracks and try to outsmart the police, the killer placed her body in a vehicle and literally drove it into a tree to deliberately fake a fatal road accident. Amazingly, 3 separate medical practitioners who initially saw the body accepted the staged scene as a tragic accident.
But the lie just couldn't survive a true forensic. During the post-mortem examination, the expert noted that the pattern and the sheer severity of those blunt force lacerations to the head were completely inconsistent with the relatively minor damage to the car. By reading the injuries, likely noting the specific shapes and that tissue bridging we talked about, which are completely inconsistent with simply hitting a windshield, right through the staged accident and proved it was a brutal murder.
Here's another fantastic mini-mystery from our source text. An assailant stabbed a victim during a quarrel, but tried to claim it was just a tragic accident. The defendant's story? They claimed the victim clumsily fell onto some broken earthenware pots, crockery, that was lying on the floor during the fight. But the forensic reality on the autopsy table told a totally different story. It showed a very clean cut with perfectly even wound margins.
The entire defense basically fell apart in an instant. Why? Well, because falling on broken pots would cause a blunt force tear, an irregular laceration that would probably contain foreign material like clay down in the wound depth, complete with crushed hair follicles and, you guessed it, tissue bridging. Instead, the perfectly clean, even margins proved it wasn't a laceration at all, it was a clean, incised knife wound. The true killer, who coincidentally happened to have a knife in his possession, was quickly convicted because his story completely defied the physics of human tissue.
Okay, before we wrap up, let's briefly touch on one last complication that detectives face, and that's water recoveries. When a body is pulled from water, projecting parts like fingers, lips, or ears often have wounds from marine animals, fish, frogs, turtles, crabs, you name it. But a trained is never going to confuse these post-mortem nibbles with a violent attack. True anti-mortem lacerations, meaning wounds inflicted before death, will always show a vital reaction, like bruising, averted edges, and gaping margins, which post-mortem animal bites completely lack.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to take this highly trained perspective with you. The next time you see a cut in a mystery movie or read about one in a true crime story, I want you to ask yourself, is it just a clean cut, or is it a jagged, crushed laceration secretly hiding the exact angle, direction, and shape of the killer's weapon? Thank you so much for joining me on this fascinating journey into the world of forensic. Keep looking closely and never, ever take a wound at face value.